Jim Cooper, the rector of Trinity and St. Paul's Church, Chapel Church, and many of our parishioners and leadership are here, but an extended, wonderful welcome to those who are coming perhaps the first time to this sacred site. It is the oldest public building in the city of New York in continuous use, and that means that it has been the occasion for great celebration since the mid-1700s. Those would be births, baptism, civic events, inauguration of presidents, Washington, and so forth. Of course, it was the capital of the United States originally. It still should be. But anyway, and also the place for remembrance and recalling the great tragedies of our time, the loss of life in the Revolution, the loss of life in the Civil War, the loss of life in Elaine, the loss of life in 9/11, the loss of life in Newtown, and all the ones in between. A place of great celebration and of mourning and prayerful reflection. Both the celebrations and the horrors lead us to the same approach. Each lead down the same path, as odd as that might sound. You don't deny either, but that you enter this holy place with a time of reflection, repentance, strategy, and a plan for action for the future. To be part of the world that intercedes, to lead a path that leads not to massacre, but the love of God and love of neighbor. So thank you for being here today to reflect on this horrific event in our history, but not just to reflect. In each individual life and collectively, various communities, to find ways for peace and reconciliation that begins with justice. One of the great friends of Trinity Church is Desmond Tutu, who's been in that particular pulpit, the one down the street, very, very often. And what was done in South Africa is a model for the world, that justice, reconciliation, confession, amendment of life is the way for a better world. So we gather in that way. Let us pray. Almighty God, send your Holy Spirit continually upon us, enliven our hearts and minds, and give us wisdom to reflect and plan and reach a way of bringing life and vitality back into the world, even though there are forces that push against that. Unite us in that common cause in your holy name. Amen.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Foy. I'm a member of Trinity Church, St. Paul's Chapel, and a member of the Task Force Against Racism that is sponsoring this program. The task force was founded in 1984 out of a conference in the Diocese of New York on racism. And from there, we began house church and talking about the difficult issues around racism, and deciding that we wanted to do something also to celebrate the work of Dr. Martin Luther King as he is celebrated in the secular community. We wanted to celebrate and use his work on that day to talk about the difficult issues and take action. And from that, many programs at Trinity have led us to do the work around eliminating the sin of racism. So over the last 18 months, Trinity's Task Force Against Racism has considered the best way to do a program around the Elaine Massacre because of the schedules of the speakers, and we determined that today would be the best day and best time. And it turns out that it is the best time and is appropriate. It turned out that we're struggling also with what's going on in Ferguson County and other issues that come up that still hold these kind of events in our lives today. I want to thank everyone who helped make this symposium possible. The Task Force Against Racism and those who are part of the Task Force Against Racism, as well as the staff of Trinity Church that worked very diligently to make this happen. And of course, the speakers who are here, who took the time to come here and speak to us about this event and issue. And a special thanks to the guest speakers and those who came to join us today from places around the world. Robert Whitaker is the author of the most extensive and recognized book around the Elaine Race Massacre. It's on the Laps of God. Bob will give us an overview of the factors and that characterize the massacre, where it happened, what led up to it, what happened during the massacre, and the reasons for the results in the court case, Moore versus Dempsey. He'll be followed by J. Chester Johnson, whom we at Trinity Church know very well, at Trinity Church in St. Paul Chapel. Chester is the author of the article Evanescence, the Elaine Race Massacre, which was published in the literary journal, Green Mountain Journal, in a 4-part series in 2013. Chester will talk about the silence around surrounding the massacre and growing in the southeast, up in southeast Arkansas, not far from the massacre. He will also spend some time talking about how he came to realize that his grandfather, whom Chester spent several years living with as a youngster, had been part of the onslaught against the sharecroppers at the Elaine Massacre. Next, Sheila Walker, a descendant of Albert Giles, one of the Elaine 12, who were convicted of murder at a speedy and unfair trial that immediately following the massacre. Sheila will discuss the way the family handled the history and experience of the event, and including the move from some members from Elaine and the great difficulty for some members in the family to talk about and recalling it, how painful that was, the terror of the massacre. She has much to tell us about those who really felt the full impact from the posses, the white posses, and the troops also. She will talk about the torture of the prisoners that were held in the county jail. Our final speaker will be David Solomon. David comes from an old and prominent family of Phillips County, Arkansas, site of the massacre. He can talk about how the locals dealt with the event or not dealt with the event, including any personal reflections he has surrounding the event. Also, he's been working with others to establish a memorial, erect a memorial around the massacre. Though the massacre occurred in 1919, no memorial currently exists. He can bring us up to speed on what's happening with that. The Elaine Race Massacre was an important event in history of our country, but little, we know little about it. And today, we indeed are fortunate enough to be able to take a moment to hear about this part of our history and understanding how it fits into what was going on at the time of the massacre, and how it impacted the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. Each of the 4 segments will be 30 minutes long, with presenters giving remarks from 15 to 18 minutes. And the remainder of the 30 minutes, we will have a question and answer time, and I really want all of you to please participate in that. All the information, questions you have, let it rip. And Frida Johnson will be out. Also, I'd like to respectfully request that you silence your cell phones or turn them off, and please, this is being taped or documentary, and I don't think any of you want to be seen on film texting during the event. Also, we have, there's an exit in the back, behind you, and to your right. And your left, there are exits, and there's also restrooms. So I will turn this over now to Chester Johnson. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to recognize 2 people who in different ways affected. You can't hear me back there. Casey, could you increase the volume a little bit? Okay, a little better? Great. I'd like to recognize 2 people who, in differing ways, affected positively and crucially this symposium, though they're not on the program. Roz Hall, who has led the task force against racism at Trinity for many years and who pushed the train out of the station for this symposium, is here, and we're fortunate to have her. I'd like to suggest we dedicate this symposium to her daughter, Lauren, who recently passed away. Next, I'd like to recognize Elizabeth Powell, editor of the prestigious literary journal Green Mountains Review. Liz got interested in Elaine and accepted and brought attention to my 4-part article, Evanescence, the Elaine Race Massacre. Thank you for attending with. I'd like to also mention that today is Ruby Dee's memorial at Riverside Church. There's an unknown fact that she and her husband, Ozzie Davis, gave a testimonial a few years ago on Elaine, even known less than today. Now I'm going to go through a set of 8 pictures very quickly that depict aspects of the Elaine, Arkansas Race Massacre. 4 of these pictures will be used as non-rotating images during the 4 individual presentations. Okay, you want to put up the map? The first image is a map of a small area just north of Elaine, Arkansas. The map will also serve as a backdrop for Bob Whitaker's remarks. In the upper right-hand corner, up here, you'd find the Hoop Spur Church, where the initial confrontation occurred on the evening of September the 30th, 1919. You'll see these wooded areas where the sharecroppers and their families hid from white posses and the federal troops with their machine guns. The Missouri Pacific Railroad tracks running parallel to Highway 44, where the posses from the north and posses from Elaine south to north made their way into the killing fields The Giles brothers' home toward the top of the map, Sheila Walker's relatives. Next. The second slide is a landscape of the white posse gathering the morning of October the 1st, after the call had gone out from Phillips County that a black insurrection was underway. White men from neighboring communities and states descended on Phillips County. This slide will be the stationary image during David Solomon's presentation later in the program. Next. This is the image of 2 sharecroppers killed in the massacre. One observer said that African Americans were stacked like cordwood. Next. This picture depicts federal troops from Camp Pike outside of Little Rock rounding up the sharecroppers, probably for incarceration at Phillips County Jail or at ad hoc installations in Elaine. This image has become iconic. It is the cover for a book written by Nan Woodruff, American Congo, a study of economic and social conditions and matters on both sides of the Mississippi River, Mississippi and Arkansas, during the first half of the 20th century. Next. The Elaine 12. It was taken at the Walls Penitentiary outside of Little Rock after the 12 had been found guilty of murder in the speedy and unfair trial. This will be the image that will be shown during Sheila Walker's comments. She'll identify her forebear, Albert Giles, who was one of the Elaine 12. Next. The next picture is of Lonnie and me. Lonnie Birch was my grandfather with whom I lived for several years after my father died when I was 1. The image is of Lonnie and me on my 2nd birthday. Lonnie is part of the Elaine story, part of my story. And my story is now part of the Elaine story. This picture will be shown during my presentation. Scipio Africanus Jones, one of the 2 heroes of the massacre. This highly able African-American lawyer from Little Rock had, 4 years following the massacre, freed all 74 sharecropper prisoners, including those guilty of murder, and implemented the strategy that altered the Supreme Court's view toward the 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process, in the case Moore versus Dempsey, creating the basis for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The second hero, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Boston Brahmin and Supreme Court Justice, who wrote the majority opinion in Moore versus Dempsey, freeing Phillips County sharecroppers and ushering in a new federal activism for the protection of all American citizens. Please remember these images as the Elaine Race Massacre is told. Bob Whitaker, author of the most significant work on this event, On the Lapse of Gods, will speak first. Bob?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And it's extraordinary what you're going to hear today because you have people so intimately connected to this event 95 years ago. This event, the Elaine Race Massacre, in one way is one of the darkest moments in our history. We'll talk about how we ended up at this dark moment. But it is, as Chester said, out of it came a legal case that really served as the foundation for the civil rights movement. It's called Moore versus Dempsey. And at the heart of it is an attorney that is an extraordinary personality, extraordinary man, Scipio Africanus Jones, which I wish every school child in America would learn about. So what's the story? How did we get to this place in 1919? Real quickly. Of course, in 1865, we get the end of the Civil War, the slaves are freed, and for a brief period of time under Reconstruction, there was a time when blacks in the South were serving on juries. There was a period of citizenship, and of course that's what they were promised with the 14th Amendment and all, the right to vote. And then we get, in essence, people can call it differently, but basically a resegregating of the South and a denial of their basic citizenship rights when Reconstruction ends. And then we get official segregation with the Jim Crow Society. And as this happens, one of the things that happens in terms of the judiciary, blacks really, there's an extrajudicial way of handling blacks who are accused of crimes, and it's lynchings, etc. So the right to a fair trial just does not exist in the South at this time. And then as we go forward, lynchings keep happening. And in the decade prior to this is racism reaches a level, and racial violence reaches a level you just can't believe. One of the things that happens out of the South, we get, of course, Jim Crow. Woodrow Wilson then enters the White House with some promises of operating a more just society, but instead he segregates the federal government. He actually introduces Jim Crow policies into the federal government, the post office, and I forget the other bureau. And I will tell you, when you then start going back and reading the newspapers from 1912, 1913, 1914, you just can't believe the racial hatred that was present. Now, as World War I comes up, remember it's the war to make the world safe for democracy, and blacks are not going to be allowed to serve initially. But the black community says, listen, if we fight in World War I, we can prove sort of our loyalty to the United States, and a promise was made to blacks by Woodrow Wilson and others. If you indeed support this war effort to make the world safe for democracy, you will return home to a different country. You'll sort of prove your citizenship and your right to citizenship. So blacks served in great numbers. By the way, initially they were not going to be allowed to serve in combat because whites were afraid they would get used to using arms. But there were a couple of black outfits. The very first American hero in World War I was a black soldier. Anyway, they returned from World War I with a sense of pride. They fought valiantly, were heroes, and they expected back now to come back to a country that said, okay, we will now give you citizenship that you're supposed to have from the 14th Amendment in 1865. Instead, it was this, as you were. In other words, this country has not changed. Go back, especially in the South, to sharecroppers where they had something called debt peonage, where you would end up in debt after each year, and that was a way, in essence, you couldn't leave the land, that sort of thing. But the black mind had changed. The African American mind had changed, and basically said, we're not going to accept what it was before. And because of that, you start to see racial fighting breaking out across the country. There's lynchings. I think there were more than 150 lynchings in 1919. Think about that. That's about 3 a week. The lynchings get ever more violent. There were lynchings where where they had public lynchings, where men were set on fire in front of people. And then we starting to get fighting breaking out in different communities. There's a race war in Chicago, Washington, D.C. It's remembered as the Red Summer of 1919. The other element in 1919 is it's also communism is on the move, and it's seen as the year of the Red Scare. So unions are also organizing. So the country by the fall of 1919 is just on edge. And you can read that there's a fear of a race war, basically a racial civil war breaking out. And it's not just in the South. The whole country is really infused with this racial sense. Now what happens in Elaine? What happens in Elaine, or to the south of here, there's a man who returns from the war named Robert Hill. And he begins organizing the sharecroppers into a union. And what they're going to do this fall is after they picked it, just a little bit of background. How did sharecropping work? Sharecropping was actually set up after the Civil War, and the idea was, in essence, to make the freed slaves, entrepreneurs, so to speak. So the idea was the land would be owned by whites, but at the end of the year, the sharecroppers would get half of the proceeds from the cotton. But what happened is, during the year, the sharecroppers would shop at the local stores owned by the sharecropper, by the plantation owners. Then they'd sell the crop, and then the plantation owner would say, oh, you spent too much money during the year at the store, you don't get any money. But what's happening in 1919? Not only is there's new attitude, but the price of cotton is going through the roof. It's going to reach an all-time high. So the sharecroppers are saying, aha, our crop is going to be worth a lot this year, and we want our fair share. So they're going to start organizing a union, and Robert Hill starts to the south, and in late September, he starts working with people to organize a union in this part of Phillips County, Elaine, which is about 25 miles south of Helena, the county capital. Now think about this. The mere act of organizing a union with the thought you're going to sue your landowners for a fair share of the cotton crop that year, that is seen as insurrection. It is challenging the established power. And as they organize this union in the days ahead, they're warned, don't do it. There'll be lynchings. You do not want to organize this union. Anyway, on the last night of September, they meet in this church right here, Spur, and they do put guards out front. So there are some men with shotguns because they're afraid that the church will be shot up. And late that night, oh, and by the way, Sheila Walker's here. There is, you can see documents that some of the people in the church, in fact, are Sheila's great-grandmother and your great-uncle, two of your great-uncles, and your great-aunt as well. And it's your great-grandmother, Sarah, and your grandmother, Annie. That's how direct this is. And you can see documented things there in the church. And there's even talk about them running from the church. Late that night, car pulls up here, stops. It's filled with a couple of white people that are related to police authorities. Exactly what happens next is uncertain, but what we do know is the church gets shot up, fire is returned, and one white person is killed. And the word then goes out, the blacks are in insurrection. And by the way, they were so afraid of this, in Helena, they had already stored arms in case this happened, and they had set up a call system that if this insurrection happened, they could gather quickly to put down the insurrection. So the next day, what happens? You first get a group of people related to an official, it's from the sheriff's office, and posse members coming with the sheriff's office. They come down from Helena, and early in the morning, a black boy runs along this road here. You see where the Giles house is, right here? A lot of blacks had gathered in the Giles house, and the black boys come in, runs and says, they're shooting all the blacks, they're shooting all the blacks, they're coming to kill us. So people flee from the Giles house, and this is a ditch, and they gather and they hide in this ditch. And for some reason, the women tend to hide more here, the men more here. The white people, that are coming officially now, this is the first wave of killing, gather here, and the order is they're going to go two sides of the Golan slope, and then they begin firing at the men hiding in that ditch. Two of the people hiding in the ditch are Albert and Milligan, your ancestors. They both get shot in the head. Her 15-year-old ancestor, Milligan, there's even a description from one of the white members, how he sees him and then shoots him in the head. So that's how graphic it is. So there's a number of men killed here. However, now they're on different sides. The white groups are on different sides of this. There's some shooting across, and a white man does get a shot here as well, probably from fire from the whites on the other side. Anyway, this is the first wave of killing right here. Then there's some other sporadic killing during the day in different parts. You can see reports. Now a report goes out to the Little Rock, to the governor, says we have this blacks insurrecting, they're killing whites left and right, because there's now 2 whites dead. And so the army arrives the next morning. Army with the governor in been told. And they come up this way, and they first gather in Elaine. They come up by the train. They come up this road here. Now, when they turn west on this road, there's already a woman slain that morning by some posses that had got there first. Now, they go out this way. Yeah, they go out this way, and at some point, because the posses had gone ahead of them, other whites, blacks now are hiding in here in the woods. And as they approach the woods, there is a shot fired from the woods. The governor is with them, and now the order goes, shoot to kill. And they are armed with machine guns. And so you can read in the documents from the military itself and the governor's own archives. He talks about being on this trip, Governor Ruff. They move north through here, and they talk about shooting them down like rabbits with machine guns. Okay? So you see killing happening here, and now in their own documents they talk about 65 to 70 blacks being killed. This first wave, they talk maybe 20. Here you have 65 to 70. Now at the same time, and I've got the chronology a little bad. So that first day, October 1st, you see people coming from Helena, some shooting there. The second thing is that afternoon, posses come over from Mississippi, outside. Your grandfather may have been a part of a posse coming up from the south that day. And what you see in the historical record is different accounts of killings in different parts. There's a plantation, by the way, out here further to the west, called the Lambert Plantation, and the owner of that later writes a memoir, and he says when the troops first arrive, the first thing they do is they tie somebody up and set them on fire. So when I was trying to document this, one of the things I did was build this map. I eventually was able to find 22 sort of killing sites. So for example, this would be one, you'd have this site, so 22 different sites where there are reports of blacks being shot and killed. And we still do not have a good idea how many people were killed, but my estimate is definitely more than 100. Remember, we have the 75 alone from the Army in their own documents. And there are other counts, it could be 150, 175. It's still unknown. But you can document 22 sites where there are reports of blacks being killed. Now, the next thing that happens is every black man in the area is rounded up. They take roughly 350 and they put him eventually in jail in Helena. Or if they actually, there's so many that they actually have to use another building as a makeshift jail. And the story that goes out at this time, and it tells you about the media, is this. There was an insurrection by blacks. They had a conspiracy to kill whites, and by the end there's, I think, 4 whites who were killed, were dead. This insurrection was put down with great care, great, in essence, lack of violence on part of the whites, and that maybe 20 blacks were killed. That's the official white story. And we're going to get a later story as black press begin to tell us what has happened. But that's the white story. 350 people were, in the prison. 122 then are charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The women are let go. It's the men who are charged. And then what happens is they're charged, and then the 12 leaders, including Sheila's Uncle Albert, great-uncle Albert, is one of the 12. They're put on trial for first-degree murder. Now, those trials lasted about an hour each. They were defended by attorneys who were plantation owners and often had been part of the group putting down the insurrection, part of the posse members. No witnesses were called on their behalf. And it was also, they did have the witnesses against them sometimes. In fact, there were 1 or 2 other blacks, and it turned out the blacks had been tortured. How had they been tortured? They had been whipped, and they had been put in an electric chair where they could ramp up the electricity until it became more and more painful. Now, the amazing thing about this small thing about the electric chair, that's what the sharecroppers later said that gave this false testimony. They said they were put in an electric chair, they'd been whipped badly, and then they were put this electric chair. And people always discounted that. That can't be true. Well, about 5 years after this, if you go through the New York Times, that electric chair is brought into the court. And they said they've been using it for years here to torture witnesses. So it was a confirmation, in essence, of the black story of being tortured. So the 12 in these trials that last about an hour are sentenced to die in the electric chair. At that point, 74 others say, whoa, don't want to have my trial. And they basically say, they plead guilty to second-degree murder and lesser charges. And the fathers of the community come out and say, no, we've never had a lynching in Helena. Let's let justice take its place. And so this became, in their mind, a way of handling this in a legal manner. It has a key here. So what happens at this point? This is when Scipio Africanus Jones shows up. So convicted to die. And now who is Scipio Africanus Jones? He's born a slave during the Civil War. 1863, I think he was born. And then he is raised on a sharecropper family, sharecropper farm. He's the one person in his family who learns to read, probably because he went to school briefly during the era of Reconstruction. He then moves to Little Rock to make his name. And there he applies to go to school at the Little Rock Law School. Of course, they tell him, "Are you kidding us? Can't go here." But he then studies for the law under the tutelage of 4 white attorneys, and he becomes, in my opinion, one of the first great civil rights attorneys in America. Beginning in the 1890s, he's fighting Jim Crow laws. He's trying to make sure that he will run for office. He founds his own party to make sure that the blacks are still participating in the political process. Uh-oh, this is it. I've gone through my 15 minutes. Story short, he eventually does this appeal. He first says these people were denied their due process rights for a fair trial. He loses that all the way to the Supreme Court. You know why? He didn't have a right to a fair trial at that time. What the Supreme Court had ruled was that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. So the Fifth Amendment, the right to not testify against yourself, that did not hold in state courts. So they go all the way to the Supreme Court, they lose it. And finally, how does Scipio Africanus Jones wins this case? He files a habeas corpus petition, and he says this, that in essence, that jury pool acted as a lynch mob. Okay? And because it acted as a lynch mob, they lost jurisdiction over that court proceeding. And so the court said, that's true. This is what all the window cones said. That you have to have some semblance of a fair trial. Because it was more like a lynch mob, they lost jurisdiction and we're going to free the men. This becomes the principle for the civil rights movement and becomes the principle for the application of the Bill of Rights to state criminal trials. Because if you don't give a person a fair trial, we're going to yank jurisdiction. So the point is, out of this horrible, horrible, tragic moment, this is one of the darkest moments in American history. You get the foundation for a new American. Thank you. I guess it's like 10 minutes for questions. How many minutes for questions? 10 minutes for questions. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. What was the makeup? Oh, I'm sorry. What was the makeup of this? I'm a little slow in my Supreme Court history, but who made up the Supreme Court at that time?
Well, Taft is the head of the Supreme Court at this time. But really the key here is 2 people. It is Oliver Wendell Holmes, and it's Louis Brandeis. Now, if you remember Louis Brandeis, he's the first Jewish judge, and he brings a much more progressive sense to this. But it was unclear. But one of the things that's really interesting is Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes, under this court, understood that if they were going to push it in a certain direction, they had to bring Taft with them. So they would go home from the court with them. So they spent years preparing for this moment. And the other thing that happened here that's really astonishing is, as they were doing this habeas corpus petition, Scipio Africanus Jones got two of the people that had participated in they were members of the railroad police and the sheriff's office, to testify now on behalf of the blacks that we tortured people, we massacred people. So think about it. Scipio Africanus Jones went to this other side and got these people to file, accounts on behalf of the blacks. Can you imagine what happened to those whites in that community? They were expelled. But the Supreme Court the key is really Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes and working with Taft to make this change. Because there had been actually a similar case a few years earlier related to another lynch mob where it sort of set the possibility of this happening, but in fact, they didn't actually yank jurisdiction. I hope I asked you a question.
Thank you. I'm a lawyer from California and from France. So I suppose that due process was made applicable to states after the 14th Amendment was adopted, because that does say that. When was that adopted? Here I'm a lawyer, I'm asking you a question.
No, this is a really good question. So he's asking, so the 14th Amendment is passed after the Civil War, and this is the one that is supposed to guarantee all people born in America equal rights, and citizenship rights and equal rights in criminal trials as well, which is the right to due process. So what happens is the Supreme Court negated the 14th Amendment. They did apply it for protections of basically the railroad owners and that sort of thing. So they protected corporate interests with the 14th Amendment. But in a series of, we can go through that, but in a series of decisions, one after another, under the states' rights things, they basically negate the 14th Amendment. And that's the whole point. By the 1880s, you see black leaders saying, or African American leaders saying, why do we even pass the 14th Amendment? Because it's not protecting us at all.
Thank you. Another quick question. You said the evidence, you started talking about Elaine, what happened to Elaine, and yet it's still blurred. After your presentation, it seemed to be very clear. Is it because the different sources are not reconciled? The sources from the government, the sources from the blacks, sources from other witnesses, and that's why you're saying that it was blurred as to what actually happened in Elaine?
Yeah, this goes to the story of how history is told, on who tells the history. So the first history that was told was obviously by white, the white power structure told that story. And in many ways that became the official story, which was about 20 were killed. Now, by the way, this becomes, the NAACP gets involved in this trial. And it's the first time they really start funding a legal challenge. And I will tell you, when it was going on, they called it the greatest struggle for justice ever waged. So at the time, this was really critical. But you know what happened? So you have a white story, okay? Now there was a man named Walter White, who was a famous investigator for the NAACP, and he could pass for being black. And he comes in a couple weeks after, and he starts talking to some of the people, and now he tells a black story. Okay, so we now get a second narrative. The second narrative is of a massacre. Very, very different. Now what's interesting is those two narratives basically get handed down. One is a white narrative of only 20 killed and sort of a restrained response. The other is of a massacre. Those are the two narratives. Now, interestingly, when Scipio gets those two men those two white policemen, in essence, members of the sheriff's office, to file briefs, as part of the briefs, documents. Well, it's not a brief, it's like, whatever, affidavit, excuse me. That's when the white story cracks, because these are insiders saying, oh no, we went down, we shot him in the head and stuff like that. We whipped him, we tortured him. But that white part never really got incorporated into the white narrative. So those two narratives arise, and then you're going to hear people didn't want to talk about it. Okay? We're going to bury it there, and I think the whole country didn't want to talk about it. And there's a whole story about how it starts to get revived. It starts to get revived in 1960. Now, when I got interested in this because of the legal case. But when I started this, one of the real things was, what did happen there? And can you reconcile these two? And one of the things that happened for me is once I began to build a map, I could start seeing that actually the white story was, they were overlapping. So for example, there's a story about blacks hiding in here, okay? And next thing you know, if you look at those two affidavits, they describe how they were given orders to shoot across and that sort of thing. So you start to see, in fact, where you can reconcile in space and time the two narratives. And if you really pay attention, the documents from the Army, for example, are telling of this massacre with machine guns. If you go out here to the land plantation, and next thing you know, you find that memoir by the owner of that, he's talking about a massacre. So why I became confident that this was a massacre of this dimension was when I could map it out in space and time. In other words, when it happened, what day, where, and in fact, when I had both white and black witnesses to it. In other words, it wasn't just the black version. Now, in fact, I had other white confirmation of this story. But if you go there now, I don't know, David Sullivan may talk about this, but when I was investigating, looking at this in there about 10 years ago or so, if you went to the museum, the official story was still about 20 whites killed, although many others say there were many more. It's a lot about how history is told. One more question. As you can see, I'm very long-winded.
I wondered if you could say just a little bit about how you got interested in this story, and if you did research in the area, how it felt to you, whether it had changed or was there resistance to your work, that sort of thing.
Yeah, two things. I came upon this story at really backdoor now. Many years ago, I'd written a couple other books. Many years ago, I worked in Attica prison. And one of the things I initially wanted to look at is how come we in prison, blacks at a rate, black men at a rate, that they're in prison at a rate nowhere else in the world. There's no country that imprisons any group of its population the way that black men are imprisoned in the United States. And I really wanted to tell a story of how that happened. How did we get to that point? And somehow I came upon the Elaine race riots and Moore versus Dempsey. Willie versus Dempsey, the Supreme Court thing. At first I'm thinking, why don't I know about this? And then I saw that this was seen as the foundation for this whole civil rights movement. And I just became interested in this legal story of the fight for equal rights, so to speak. So for example, my understanding was, I thought the Bill of Rights applied to the states from the beginning. I didn't know the Bill of Rights didn't apply to states. I thought maybe they didn't, honor it, but I thought it did. So that was sort of, in other words, I came to this as a neophyte. And I'm sure most attorneys know the Bill of Rights doesn't apply. The public does not. And then I became fascinated by Scipio Africanus Jones. What an extraordinary man, self-educated. Imagine him coming in. He has to actually go to investigate things that happened in Helena. He's worried about his life. During the trial, it's a long story, but there was another retrial. He actually had to hide out at times in black houses because he was afraid of being lynched. And then Scipio does something so extraordinary. He goes to the sheriff and says, "Will you keep me safe?" In other words, he looks at that guy in the best way possible. "I believe you will keep me safe." And the sheriff says, "I'll keep you safe." But Scipio was always looking at the best of people. Finally, in terms of what it was being there, it's still, and you can hear people that know the area much better than I did. I went there a few times. It was a little awkward. It wasn't, people weren't so happy talking about it. And I can tell you a couple of stories. But it was interesting, the black community, especially the poor black community, really embraced me, took me around to descendants of sharecroppers. So that side was interested in the story being told more. There was still a lot of, I think, resistance to the story being told by the sort of ruling fathers of the time. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yes. Before I start, I want to tell a story. I want to do two things. One, I want to acknowledge the three other people in this room from Helena, Phillips County. My two brothers, maybe in life, Chester's discussion couldn't have been more moving. And I want to acknowledge publicly a debt that I'll never be able to repay. Chester and I were classmates many, many years ago and barely knew each other. We met 3 or 4 years ago in New York City and got into Elaine. And Chester turned my interest from genealogy and family into a moral and spiritual quest. And as I say, that's a debt I'll never be able to repay. Okay, a few facts. Elaine is a tiny place, tiny and isolated. It was in 1919, it is today. There may have been 4,000 people in south of Phillips County. In 1919, there were probably 1,000 today. I hate using the word plantation because people think of tar going to the wind. And I hate using the word farm because people think of corn crops. Well, so the term that I prefer, the one that's used there, is place. Elaine on down in Phillips County was a place of vast corporate agriculture, agribusiness, we call it today. These are not little bitty places. These are 1,000 to 20,000 acres, and very isolated. My family is involved in the Elaine Massacre story in almost every dimension. North of Hoop Spur, 3 or 4 miles, is Tugwell Spur, which is one of the family places. My grandfather volunteered to join the posse on the first day. And to give you an example of the hysteria of the white community, which has been building and building, as Bob explained to us, he was turned down because he had 2 children. And they expected this to be an all-out war, and they were only accepting single men. My grandfather was one of 8, 6 males, 2 females. They were entrepreneurial, and they all worked together. So my Uncle Leif took care of the place at Tugwell. My Uncle Joe, they all owned everything together, just a question of who did what to do. My Uncle Joe signed a telegram that demanded, called upon the governor to send in the troops. He was the head of something called the Businessmen's League. One of my cousins was present in Elaine and arrested the Johnston brothers. A story we probably don't have time to go into, but it's as tragic as any of these. And when I got interested in Elaine 15 or so years ago, I started to quiz my father about it. My father was born in 1916. He continues to practice law at the age of 98. Of course, he knew all of his uncles and aunts. His best friend was, one of his best friends was Happy Kitchens Jr., a sheriff of Phillips County after his father, Happy Kitchens Sr., who was the sheriff at the time of the Elaine Massacre. And as a lawyer, he knew all of the lawyers who represented the black defendants in the Elaine trials, with the possible exception of Green Quarles, who was a good deal older. In fact, one of them, Judge Fink, was my father's next-door neighbor and somewhat of a mentor to him during his early career. And I couldn't believe, as I talked to my father, other than the story he told about his grandfather, I couldn't believe that he knew nothing about the Elaine Massacre. I always assumed that it was just a matter of professional reticence. He's been a lawyer for 75 years. He knows lots of secrets and he doesn't the more I have talked with him, the more I believe that he and all of the rest of the community, white and black, suffer from amnesia on this subject. They haven't talked about it. They don't want to talk about it. And it is largely unknown. So it was not a subject in the schools. There are no memorials. There's none of that. And so I, Chester, a few other people, have decided that the time has come that we need to talk about this as a community. So we're advancing plans to create a memorial. And the memorial has, as far as I'm concerned, 3 parts. One is a narrative to explain what went on. The other is all the names that we can put up, that we can find. And the third is a little meditation that Chester wrote. And we have been, I think, granted the right to put this in a memorial plan for the courthouse square. And we plan on doing that. I have been informed by back channel that there would be no good putting a memorial down in Elaine because it won't last a week. It's going to be blown up, disappear in some way. But we don't think that a public square in Illinois that's going to happen, particularly as part of a structure they wish to put up for some reason. I can't comprehend. But anyway, we're going to do that. Now, it would take those of us who know something about the Elaine mob, Gil Stockley, and a few other people, a matter of weeks to develop a narrative. But that isn't the point. The point is that we need buy-in from all segments of the community. We've got 3 years to the 100th anniversary. And it is our intention to gather as many people who are willing to participate, to discuss and agree a narrative of the Elaine Massacre. And we hope this will take the form of reconciliation. I mean, obviously, the larger group, maybe 50 people, maybe more, is not going to write it down. But they're going to have to debate it. And what we have on our side, the community, although there is amnesia, there are these underlying justifications that are present and alive to this day. There are people who insist this was an insurrection by African American tenants. The African American narrative is, of course, entirely different. And we've got, I think, to come to some kind of reconciliation, if we can, about what happened and what was the meaning of what happened. One of my nightmares, and I'm serious about this, is that I'm going to be responsible for turning what has been cold hostility for almost 100 years into hot hostility. And I have no way of addressing that and dealing with that. And it's not going to deter us from going ahead. But we're going to go ahead. How much we involve the state of Arkansas, and even at the national level, I do not know. We're going to need, as I say, there are, I have specifically targeted for inclusion in this group 2 different people, one of whom is white, one of whom is black. The white person, family had a very large place down at Elaine, and to this day, he insists that all the actions are justified. And it's hard to make judgments, but he's not that racist. He's in his 80s, 70s, 80s. On the other hand, there's a fiery middle-aged woman in the black community who I think would machine gun all the whites in the county if she could. And I want to invite them all into this group if they'll participate, because it's better that they shoot at us from the inside than that they shoot at us from the outside. And we'll see what happens. Someone asked me what was in it for me. Why was I doing this? And it was a very good question. It took me a while to work it out. At one level, at one simple level, it's my own personal reparations for the actions of my grandparents' generation, my family. I hasten to tell you that my father and his sister came from a set of political and moral principles, which they passed on to us. So the chain, my father frequently muses about it, how did the chain be broken? But it did. And thank God it did. At the highest level, maybe we can affect some kind of reconciliation. I don't know. It would be nice. But if it doesn't happen, we're still going to put something up. And let the chips fall where they may. I think I'm going to stop right here because it's been a long day for all of you. And if I start further down the line, it's going to be a lot more stories. It's going to be a lot longer. So, any questions?
Take your time.
The federal judge in the Eastern District of Arkansas was a man by the name of Jacob Schreiber, an immigrant from Germany, got to Helena as a child, grew up, became a lawyer, was a Republican, became U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, brought one of the first peonage cases ever brought, and then was appointed a federal judge. He happens to be a cousin, and he's the first Jew who was ever made a federal judge. He made some of the early ruling in what became Moore versus Dempsey, which were definitely on the liberal side, and he stopped execution at least, I think, twice. The present federal judge, the chief judge of the Eastern District of Arkansas, is from Helena. He's black. His grandparents, his grandfather was a doctor, his grandmother was a pioneer, a black educator. His father was a doctor, he's a federal judge. And his grandfather's brother-in-law, who was a dentist, and the brother-in-law's three brothers, one of whom was a doctor. The other of whom had just come back from serving in France in World War II, were callously and deliberately murdered in the Elaine Massacre. They were hunting in the south of the county. They had nothing to do with any of this, except that the doctor had been resented for a number of years by the white establishment because he was a doctor and educated. They were they'd been hunting in the south of the county. They were passing through Elaine on October the 1st. They were arrested, handcuffed, put in cars, driven to Helena, and on the way, the only eyewitness says one of them reached for the deputy's gun, and as a result, all four were murdered and left on the side of the road. Anyway, go back to Judge Schreiber's story. So this federal judge has decided, for reasons of his own, to name the courthouse for Judge Schreiber. We will get that done probably in the next year as a sort of a preliminary to an Elaine memorial. Okay, questions? I don't care.
First of all, let me say thank you to all of the speakers promoting this afternoon. And Before I ask my question, could everybody give a round of applause to these people? As a boy from the Caribbean, I never thought I would come to the point when I would hear stories like these told. Most of it I read. But my question would be to you now, in the age in which we are, and the times in which we now live, how much of this is going on now in terms of racism in our country?
Okay, I will tell you what my brother and sister-in-law experienced in June. Raymond, do you want to get up and tell the story? The guy, it was his story, you know, the guy who, this is my brother Raymond Symposium, but the guy at that receipt.
So Helena is a Civil War site, and it is that the state has invested a lot of money. It was a battle that would have been famous, but Vicksburg fell the same day as Helena, so no one cared that Helena fell, and that the Union won the battle. But they restored the site, so my wife and I were in Helena. We went to see a new site that has, and we get out of the car, and we're looking at the big historical marker, and this man, your typical bum. This is a 250-pound overall man, and he's reading this thing about the loss of the battle, the Union victory, and he looks at us and he says, "It's too bad we lost. We wouldn't have in the White House today what we have." That's what he said, and my wife from Staten Island was aghast, and I just muttered something and we walked on. And as he left, I turned to her and said, "That was a sign of social progress." And she looked at me like I had two heads. I said, 30 years ago, he wouldn't have not used the words to describe what was in the White House today. He would have used the N-word, and it would have been open, but he knew enough not to say to me, a total stranger, he had no idea whether I was from Helena or not from Helena, that he didn't say. And you know, that is a difference. What's going on? Is that where we want to end up? No. But is that a step along the way? Yes.
Okay, sorry, please.
I understand that he's not beloved now, but President Clinton has a library, I think, in Arkansas.
In Little Rock, his presidential library.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, would not this be an appropriate place to set up a reconciliation kind of a symposium?
We may well get to that, but we got to start locally. We really got to start locally.
How far away? I mean, I have no idea about the.
2 hours. 2 hours. Little Rock's in the center of the state. Arkansas, Helena, Phillips County is on the eastern, is on the Mississippi River on the eastern side. It's 2 hours. We have to start locally. There has to be some agreement, I believe, between the black and white community about what all this means. And I want you to know that the black community is just as fractured as the white community is. There is many different opinions in the black community. I understand, as there are in the white community on this subject.
Hi, my question is in laying the groundwork for this memorial.
Right.
Is there an effort to work amongst clergy people? And are they also as fragmented and angry and so forth, or is there some progress there?
The answer is we will involve it's very complicated. The traditional Christian and Jewish communities have disintegrated in Helena. Presbyterian Church has 10 members. We closed the synagogue in 2007. Methodist Church has just merged three Methodist churches, and they're struggling. And the reason the Episcopalian Church manages to keep going, even with a smaller number of members, is that they have an enormous endowment. So as long as there's one Episcopalian left in Helena, Arkansas, there will be a minister. They just redone the church. It's quite gorgeous. So the Christian community, the white Christian community, is fragmented among a lot of evangelical, charismatic. Similarly, the black community, largely Baptist, but many other denominations and sects is equally fragmented. So it's kind of hard to round them up, but we sure as hell want to do that. We have to do that, but it's really hard.
Well, hi, David. First, I would like to say I really, just again, I think I'm just really honored to be sitting here and listening to the things that you all presented to us. My question for you is I want to go back to something that Bob Whitaker mentioned. He said that he believed there are two narratives about what happened.
Right.
There's a white narrative and a black narrative. And we just heard a presentation from Sheila about her understanding of her experience or understanding of the history of her family. I want to know, my question is two parts. One, do you think that there really is a white narrative and a black narrative for what happened? And number two, how important is Sheila's story in understanding or reconciling the two of those narratives?
I guarantee there is a white and black narrative. One was white narrative simply, quote, outside agitators came and stirred up locals with plans to murder the leading planters and take the cotton crop, or something like that. And the actions were fully justified, and very few African Americans died. To the extent I understand the black narrative from books and from whatnot, it's an outrageous violation of human rights, of civil rights, and outright murder. Walter White, who did come to Helena, left within, I think, 24 hours. He was scared out of his mind, and he passed for white. I mean, no, this is bad stuff. I don't know whether Sheila's story helps, but I know that the presence of someone like her. One more question. I'm anybody who heard. Was there somebody in there? That's name. Sorry.
Yes, I would just like to say I was very moved by a lot of the speeches this afternoon and what was said. And I wonder, going back to what Chester said in reference to listen to the humanity on the other side, do you think we can learn something from reconciliation movements in South Africa and also to some degree in Germany when they're trying to reckon with the Nazi atrocities?
The South African one is very rich. The other one that I have paid attention to is what occurred in Oklahoma in the 90s. I don't know if you know this, in 21 or 23 in one day, the richest black community in the South, outside of, let's say, Atlanta, was wiped out in one day, leveled to the ground, and 500, 600 people fled, and nobody knows how many were killed. Anyway, and there was an official reconciliation actually a state-sponsored commission. It wasn't totally successful. The other thing that I've been exploring is the psychoanalytic concept, not that I know much about it, psychoanalytic concept of intergenerational trauma. I think this is a clear case of the trauma of the event. And I want to tell you that this white trauma, the whites were incredibly hysterical. You cannot believe some of what was going on and what they were feeling. The trauma has pervaded the generations of the community, and that's why they don't talk about it. So we hope to learn something from that. Okay?
I would like to thank all the speakers and this event, and I hope you take something away and some action has welled up from what you heard. I'd like to have Dr. Cooper come in.
We have listened so intently because when we hear the story of this town, we know it's our town as well. This is more iconic, perhaps. The second thing, perhaps, is to know that when you hear a story, you probably haven't heard all of the story until you dug a little deeper. So thank you for broadening our understanding. And the last piece I would share is the part that was said that the progress is not passed down. We got to learn it each and every generation, and so the next generation and ours needs to relearn it, and to do it as soon as possible. Never too late, but don't wait too long, or we will all be too late. I want to introduce for the closing prayer the Reverend Dr. Bill Lupfer, who is the 18th rector of Trinity Church, and I'll be his partner for a few months. You know, 318 years to only have 18 people serving in this position is quite staggering.
I'd like to point out that I'm not the rector yet. If you have any tough questions, talk to Dr. Cooper. In the call process, I was asked many questions. One was, what is your most important concern? And I said, racism. I am so thrilled to be here today and to be here with you. When in the call process, the next question to me came, well, what would you do about that? And I said, the only thing I've seen effective is what I call narrative theology. I'm a priest, forgive me, but narrative theology, telling your story and listening to other people tell their story and tell the truth while we're doing it. And so to be here and back and hear this unfolding of these incredibly powerful stories, and to see the friendships that have been developing. I've been focusing on Jesus' words. I no longer call you disciples, I call you friends. I think the power of friendship, especially across racial lines, is enormous. It's sad to think that we still have to talk in these basic ways today, but I'm thrilled that we're doing it and that we have this group here at Trinity that is strong, and I want you to know I will be strong with you. When I get in the rector's chair, February 16th, 2015, and then I'm going to cling to that chair as long as I can. So we're going to go forward, and we're going to do this with friendship, with honesty, and with reconciliation. So I invite you now to stand if you can for a final prayer. Lord, I thank you for my friends gathered here, the ones I know and the ones I still have to meet, for our speakers today who have been courageous and honest. I pray that we may take some of their courage and honesty forward in our own lives, that we may examine our own selves, our own lived experience, our own families, and that we may reach out in friendship to others. Pray that when we do that, we can represent you, we can show you who reach out so much. And so in the spirit of reconciliation and friendship and joy, I pray that we conclude our time now renewed and invigorated so that we can go forward and be a powerful force in this world. In your name we pray. Amen.
Stand.
Before moving to Elaine, a few words about this unique space, if you don't mind. My wife Frida and other members of the family here, we've shared a lot in the territory of this chapel. Immediately after the 9/11 attacks, St. Paul's Chapel became the relief center for the recovery workers at Ground Zero, just out that door. There was a refuge of care, feeding, and solace for recovery workers over the entire 9 months of cleanup. In 2005, an organization, the Community of the Cross of Nails, which arose out of World War II, and more specifically, the bombing of Coventry Cathedral in England by the Germans and of Dresden by the Allies, designated St. Paul's Chapel as a special place for reconciliation. Part of today's symposium will focus on reconciliation, racial and generational. There is no better spot for this effort. I should start the discussion of the journey to Elaine with the concept of regrettable unknowing. Monticello, Arkansas, where I lived most of my life until I went away to college when I was almost 18, is located in the southeast region of the state, only one county away from Phillips County, where the Elaine Race Massacre occurred. Further, during the height of the civil rights movement, before integration of the school systems there, I went back to Monticello and taught in the all-African American public school. One could rightly assume that based on the duality of those experiences, I had learned most of the history of race relations in that area of the state. Indeed, I had also taken Arkansas history during my youth and knew Southern history reasonably well, I thought. In 2008, after reaching the age of 60, I was asked by the Episcopal Church, as a number of you are aware, to write the litany of offense and apology in prose and poetry for the National Day of Repentance, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating, for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. As I worked on that litany, I reread and renewed my familiarity with writers like W. E. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells Barnett, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Gwendolyn Brooks, Richard Wright, among others. But it was Ida B. Wells Barnett, the anti-lynching advocate and historian, who brought me to startledom when I discovered a small volume of 60 pages she had authored on the Elaine Race Massacre. Yes, in Arkansas. Yes, in nearby Elaine. She described the deaths of so many African Americans, the trials, the verdicts and penalties meted out by the local courts. Her trips from Chicago to the Walls Penitentiary outside of Little Rock, when she posed as a family member of one of the prisoners to get access to the Elaine 12, who were repeatedly scheduled for execution, including Sheila's forebear, Albert Giles. I reached out to former high school classmates and asked them what they knew about the Elaine Race Massacre. Nothing. I never heard it discussed in family circles or in casual conversations at Monticello cafes or coffee shops or at church or social gatherings. Nothing. Anger was my immediate reaction to this regrettable unknowing. Of course, there had been an abundance of reasons to keep silent about it on both sides. The old saw that the more one picks at a scab, the worse it bleeds, was repeatedly employed as a reason for not revisiting the massacre. Enough blood flowed from the scab of racism. Later, I read Bob Whitaker's definitive work on the lapse of gods and other pieces about Elaine, but it was Bob's more expansive book, like a piece of spiritual text that held revelatory effects. A book that began to unlock well-kept secrets. Well-kept secrets. Some maybe that I could have preferred on a personal level or two, still buried. However, if I weren't interested in seeing them all unburied, then what made me any different from those who had thought for decades that Elaine, left alone, constituted the best course? Pieces coming together, such as the various roles of employees from the Missouri Pacific Railroad during and after the massacre that included supplementing local law enforcement and the torturing of prisoners held in the Phillips County Jail. The white posses that gathered from surrounding communities and states to repel a conjured black insurrection. The headquarters of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union being located only 6 miles away from a family farm. The killing fields with the African American sharecroppers and their families right next to the railroad tracks outside of Elaine. And so much more. Much more. Pieces coming together. My father died of cancer when I was 1. Since my mother couldn't cope very well for the next several years, until about the time I was to enter the 1st grade, I lived during that interim with my maternal grandparents, Lonnie and Hattie Birch. My names for them always being Lonnie and Hattie. My only other sibling, an older brother, filled much of that period with our paternal grandparents. Lonnie had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad and occupied his days, as I recollect, caring for and being with me. I recall many hours in his lap on the front porch, watching cars and people go by. A porch chair could be overturned and magically, shortly after the end of World War II, become a fighter pilot's cockpit. Lonnie and I took long walks together. We celebrated birthdays, Easter, Christmas together. When I fell down, he picked me up and gently assuaged my scrapes and bruises. There is a single dominant figure in my memory from those early years, Lonnie. I never once remember his raising his voice or correcting anything I ever did. In 1919, at the time of the Elaine Race Massacre, Lonnie lived and worked as a railroad engineer for the Missouri Pacific Railroad in McGee, within DeShay County, immediately south of Phillips County, site of the massacre. He also had an interest in the Birch family farm that was located in the northern part of DeShay County, though his brothers did the actual farming there. McGee was the hub for the railroad company's operation in that area of the state, and the launching point for most who would make their way to Elaine, including the federal soldiers. It had not been a secret Lonnie belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. Stories circulated within the family how he rose some nights and put on his sheeted hood, coming back several hours later, never discussing what had occurred. A couple of years before I entered high school, out of the blue, without provocation or for any apparent reason, while she was driving me someplace, Mother casually mentioned Lonnie had participated in what she called, ironically, when reviewed in retrospect, a well-known race riot while in the employ of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. Later on, she editorialized from time to time how Lonnie traveled on a train from McGee to the battle during the races. Bloody engagement with the blacks had been near the railroad tracks, presumably also close to the train which he had driven or on which he had been an occupant. Looking back on the history of the time when the Elaine Race Massacre happened, what other race massacre or so-called race riot had there been near McGee, except for Elaine? There weren't any. Yes, history disclosed there were lynchings or the burning alive of African Americans about that time in Star City, Monticello, McGee, and Lake Village within southeast Arkansas, but no massacre or riot, except for Elaine. In the 4-part article I wrote on this subject for Green Mountains Review, I used conditional words like Lonnie's likely or probable participation in the massacre. A few months ago, Bob Whitaker joined me for dinner, and we talked extensively about the evidence surrounding Lonnie's likely or probable role. After going through it all in detail, I walked away from dinner knowing I could continue to use likely or probable, but considering the preponderant evidence, it was my own peculiar patina to employ those conditional words which lay on top of and shadow the real truth that Lonnie did indeed participate in the Elaine Race Massacre. In my readings that dealt with the period in which the massacre happened, I recollect references to that region of Arkansas at the time as the heart of darkness, as Joseph Conrad empowered the phrase. And it may have been, with my own grandfather's propensity adding in goodly supply, no doubt, to the pool of darkness that spread murderously and perniciously over the land. Yet he was kind to me and protected me at my most vulnerable age and stage. I will not try to resolve the 2 lines. It would be false, serpentine, and artificial to try. Still, I know unreservedly my own path to Elaine was in part to discover a slice of him that still baffles and repulses my personal conscience. In August 2012, an official and friend from the University of Arkansas, who was also a friend of David Solomon, joined me in Phillips County. As we walked and rode by and through the killing fields and adjacent areas in the fierce and thick summer sun and August Arkansas humidity, we held an eerie notion we could be surveying a concealed factor in our country's genome. At the time, 2 related conclusions came to mind. First, little change to most of the landscape or along the narrow dirt roads had taken place since 1919. Though the sharecropper shacks and some of the wooded spots and coppices where African Americans hid themselves from both the white posses and the federal troops had completely disappeared, replaced by expanded farmland. Second, no one ever intended to set any historical reminder in that place, a marker of explanation, a monument, a memorial of any kind, so future generations could know with a degree of certainty that several whites and more than 100 and perhaps hundreds of African Americans died in humble and unremarkable fields and in like spaces within Phillips County as part of one of the most important racial confrontations in our country's history. In my quest to cite an existential piece of Lonnie among the ruins of the Elaine Race Massacre, I had, after all, concluded history to be doubtless. Too much and too little abided in the fields and fury of Phillips County for Lonnie and me to inhabit any amicable turf there. Too much intervening and unsympathetic time, too much dismay as I turned the leaves of record, which bore too much dissent and strife and turpitude, too little comity, too little heart. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there exists an overarching tenet that the individual will must express itself morally, that is, in one form or another, good or bad. In that respect, the most immediate and constant form of expression of that morality lies in the social dimension or our behavior toward each other. Not because our neighbors are simply ciphers for God, but because we are all individually worthy of love. That we can and should love others as we love ourselves. An obstacle to this higher moral achievement in our expressions toward one another in America, generation after generation, consists of implacable racism that rises repeatedly, 400 years and going strong. Why don't we learn? Why can't we learn? Why do the Fergusons, or worse, occur repeatedly? Rosanna Warren, daughter of the famous Southern writer Robert Penn Warren, and renowned writer in her own right, recently sent me a note on the relevance of this symposium, saying this excerpt: "It is very important that Trinity is hosting this symposium. In the face of our monstrous amnesia, we need to keep refreshing our sense of the human. Yes, yes, and yes," close quote. In a very much related comment, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote 150 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn anew in each generation that which is genuinely human. I'm nearly 70, and I've come to believe that Rosanna Warren and Kierkegaard are right. We alone open up ourselves to the genuinely human. That is what we can do. That is our grace as humans. Otherwise, we are continually plagued by that eternal no, N-O, which we sometimes call evil or sin, if you will, of which racism is an elemental part. A few months ago, through the good and kind efforts of Bob Whitaker, Sheila Walker and I made contact for the first time. Our initial conversation consisted of a telephone call that lasted about 2 hours. I remember Frida coming in at one point and passing a note, asking me if everything was okay. Yes, it was all right. It was more than all right. Sheila and I had indeed known each other for a very long time, even though we had never met. It was the first contact. It was the contact we wished our forebears could have had instead of the inferno our antecedents had mutually shared. One as an instrument of a merciless onslaught against the other, the murdered and brutalized. By the time we hung up the telephone, I think we both realized we had known each other for 100 years. I knew Sheila's family, who resided in the area that would become part of the killing fields. Sally Giles and her 2 sons, Albert, who had been hunted down and shot several times, and 15-year-old Milligan, whom Smitty, a security official from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, shot in the face. I knew those in Sheila's family who could not bear to talk about the Elaine race massacre without trembling and sobbing. By the end of our call, she recognized and acknowledged the 2 sides of Lonnie, although she had seen him before in 1,000 different costumes and settings. A few weeks ago, or a few weeks later, we met in person at the home of her son Marcus and her daughter-in-law Francie in Boston. As soon as I walked in the front door, Sheila and I embraced for a very long time. And you can look at Ferguson and say those similarities existed in Elaine. And what are they? One being this irrational fear that Bob went through in some detail. And then this exaggerated response. I mean, you know, the policeman who shot Michael Brown 6 times, and Michael Brown not having any gun. There's that aspect of the exaggerated response. And then there's the institutional arrogance that always rises. I mean, in Elaine, you know, you had more than 100, maybe hundreds of African Americans. No whites were ever arrested or put in trial or put in jail or anything like that. And Ferguson, you had the ability, or some people in the institutional world had the ability, they didn't have the ability to fill out an incident report, but they had the ability to go to find a tape that showed Brown lifting a few cigars. I mean, to me, that comments to the institutional arrogance that is another face of racism. And then the other part being that of the insensitivity. As I think I indicated at the beginning, there was this, observer said that African Americans were stacked like cordwood. And then Ferguson, you had Michael Brown out there for 4 hours. Lack of sensitivity. And I would actually say that if you look at most racial incidents over history, they would all carry those 4 characters. Sorry. Wait, I'm sorry.
Hi, Chester. This is more a comment than really a question. I know you, I worship with you, I've worked on committees with you, and I have to say, this is maybe the most beautiful narrative I've ever heard. It's so painful hearing this whole story of what happened, what took place. But I guess the most compelling thing is that you're an ancestor who, your life has been just dedicated to unity and serving God. For you to stand up there and acknowledge what took place through your own ancestry, it just feels so good. I'm really choked up because I think, well, I can speak for this black man, just for you to acknowledge that pain. It means everything.
I'm choked up too.
That's a hard question to follow. But I'm actually going to follow it with a question with a broader lens about what's going on today in our world that relates to this beyond things like Ferguson. I'm talking about our political structure. In 2008, we elected our first African-American president. I think most of us in here were thrilled and were hopeful that we were going to see a period of change. And in fact, we've seen a period of fighting that change with lots of money. The Supreme Court has declared corporations to be citizens, and we have groups like the Koch brothers, we have Wall Street, which is the darker side, I guess, of Trinity. I mean, it's part of our history and heritage. And my question really is about what's going on now with the gerrymandering, it's not as blatant as Ferguson, but it's more insidious. The racist sort of thing that is transpiring with all these Tea Party, crazy, extremist, right-wing, racist groups that have a loud voice. And I'm hoping that their voices are overcome by your testimony and our good faith here. But I have a real concern about what we have coming in the next election, with particularly the gerrymandering of voting to keep people from voting. Like one state, I can't remember which state it is, has decided that they won't accept out-of-state ballots anymore. And all sorts of things like that about IDs for people. I know this is sort of a little off topic, but
the only thing I could say, John, in response to that, because an individual doesn't necessarily have particular ability to make wholesale changes in terms of how things are gerrymandered or whatever. My initial response to that is what I said in my remarks. That is, picking up what Rosanna Warren and Kierkegaard said, that every generation has, well, individuals make the decision, but we don't really, we believe that previous generations somehow teach us. I'm talking about the genuinely human, the stuff that where you live in your gut, where your spiritual life talks to. And all I can say is, that while all this may be all this noise that may be going on around us, it is that sort of personal grace to be able to work toward the genuinely human that makes us whatever we are. One more.
Thank you, Chester.
Yes, sir.
I applaud your courage, first of all, because you easily could have uncovered this about your family, your beloved grandfather. You could have sat on it, and nobody would have made you the less. Well, that's my grandfather. I can't talk about him. I applaud your courage, first of all. And then my question is, how do you relate to your family? I don't mean your family that you have created. I mean to your descendants. Your mother, your father, your paternal grandparents, and how do you relate to them? Can you look at them face to face? And what kind of stories about your descendants do you have?
Thank you. That's a great question. One of the advantages that I have is that I'm an orphan. I mean, I have known my parents. I mean, they're long gone, and I only have one older brother, and he still lives in Lake Village, Arkansas, which is way down in the southeast part of the state. And even though I've told him about the article that I wrote, which is much more extensive than this, I don't think he's ever read it. I don't think he'd want to read it. And there have been times we went for several years of not talking because he sent me a lot of information during the first time that Obama ran for office. And I asked him, I said, I love hearing about you and your family, but quit sending me that stuff. And he then sent me a long letter and said, we're going to meet on the other side. The next time that you can talk to me, I don't want to hear from you again. You can talk to me on the other side. And for several years, that's the way it's been. And then about, say, maybe eight months ago, he sent me a letter and said, I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't mean to do it. And we've sort of tried together. So it's not easy, but what we are comfortable, where we feel where we are, where we really live. And so anyway, that and he's the only relative that I really have a deep nature in Arkansas.
Can we just take one more? She had her hand up for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wondered from either you or Mr. Whitaker what role women played besides hiding in a ditch during that massacre.
Bob has a lot more knowledge on that subject. So I'll let you want to respond to it. I have one thing I want to read before I let it go. But no, you get this and I'll go.
Well, actually, she was going to talk a little bit. Excuse me. Sheila's going to talk a little bit about this, how they tended to the men in prison. This goes a little bit to history, though, too, because what you do hear about, so the men get rounded up, the women do not. There is a little bit of information about how the women then returned home and found that their homes, their small cabins had been ransacked, etc. And then that they're in a horrible position. Their men are locked up or dead. And they're now no money, houses have been ransacked, but there is information about them sort of staying around and trying to support their men during the time of the trials. Then they disappear. By this, I mean, you can't track what happens to that population. You can imagine they want to leave, right? This was what you just can't track. So the honest answer to you is they're sort of peripheral characters. Now, Sally's so central, interestingly, because she shows up in the church right away. They meet around her house, so she's clearly an important part of the community. But one of the tough parts of this story is, in fact, like what happened to the community afterwards. They just disappeared. I couldn't even find them in the 1930 census. Really, they just gone. You can't find them in phone books, nothing. It tells you a lot about the status of that population. They go all over. This is what was so amazing when Sheila got to touch with them. It was the first time I heard a story of a whole family and how it was affected and going forward with history. Your question is a great one. The truth of the matter is it goes again to how history is told. We have a story basically what happened to black men, and we have a white story. But the white women just are very, very peripheral. I will say one thing. One of the best records of what happened economically comes from a woman. It's Ida B. Wells Barnett. Yeah. If you read that pamphlet, she talks about money, how many acres they had, how many cows they had, how much money they would have gotten. And that's where we do get a little sense of the domestic life that was completely disrupted.
Thank you.
Sheila is up. Can you hear me? Sheila is up next. I just want to underscore, Sheila has really unlocked a lot of chapters in the Elaine story. And there's no question that she will unlock a lot more in the future.
Everyone can hear me now. No, I can't hear. Can't. Okay, can you hear me now? No. Think back there. Okay, I'm going to try to speak as loud as I can. This is, I think, about the height of how loud I can speak. I first heard about the Elaine riots, or knew that something went on in my family in 1973. My husband, my son, and brother-in-law took a trip to Arkansas. I was born in Arkansas, Hot Springs, to visit my grandmother. And my grandmother was started to tell a story about having a premonition that something bad, that someone was going to shoot into a church. There was a meeting at a church that she was attending. And so she kind of got to gather the children together, and they went towards the back of the church. And as she's talking about this, she gets really re-stimulated with the events that happened in Elaine that night, with the shooting into the church, people dropping to the floor, and she goes into hysterics, and I don't get the story. Over the years, I tried to get that same story from my grandmother. She would get to that certain point where she's overwhelmed, goes into hysterics, and I never get that story. And she dies in 1991 without me even knowing what she was ever talking about. Somewhere around 92 or 93, I asked my mother, what is it that I called my grandmother Mama, that Mama was talking about, and she would just get all hysterical about, and my mother says, oh, she was trying to tell you about the Elaine riot. And I asked my mother, well, what is that? And she says, well, I didn't get much of that story myself, so I really don't know. And about the same time, we had just invested in a computer and went on the internet, so I started searching how the Elaine riots, and I put in all kind of different things. And it came up, and there were some old Phillips County newspaper articles, and it was speaking about the insurrection of the sharecroppers against the farmers and how they were put down, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going through these articles, and I'm going over from October the 1st was the first article, October the 2nd, October the 3rd, and I see a name, a last name that I recognize. My grandmother's her maiden name was Giles, Giles. And I see this name of one of the people that was captured, started giving evidence, testifying against, or not testifying, but giving statements against those sharecroppers that were involved in who killed who. And the name was Milligan Giles. So I called my mother up. I asked her, who's Milligan? I've never heard of this Milligan Giles. Who is this person? There's a Giles mentioned. I'm looking at these articles, and there's a Giles mentioned, but who's Milligan? And she says, oh, that's your Uncle Jim. And I says, Uncle Jim? I always thought Uncle Jim's name was James. So she says, no, his name was Milligan, I guess middle name James Giles, but they all called him Jim. So Uncle Jim gave testimony, and he pointed out who was involved after he was captured in the Elaine riots. Wow, that's nothing to be really proud of, you know. Then there came up, periodically I would just kind of look it up to see if there was any more information. And then there was a book that came out by a Grief Stockley, a lawyer, an Arkansas lawyer. And I immediately bought that book, read that book, and it gave facts, and it gave what the climate of Arkansas was, and it mentioned my Uncle Albert, and it mentioned my Uncle Jim Milligan. It mentioned their names in it, and what, you know, where they were shot, and etc. And it talks about the Moore versus Dempsey trial and how the NAACP was involved in this case. I read the book, facts, put it down, and then I started talking to my mother about it, and I started talking to my children about it. And my daughter, who was in undergrad, said, Mom, there's a book being written. There was a book being written about it. Either one of her professors or a friend of hers mentioned the book, On the Lapse of God. She said, you should get that book and read it. And I did, and that's the book that Bob wrote. That book spoke to me. It was a more personal story of what happened to the sharecroppers. It kind of gave a more rounded picture of what happened. that night on September the 30th and in some of the ensuing days afterwards. Now, I read this book and I put it down. And last year, a sister of mine passed away. This is my second sister who died, my youngest sister. And I was just sitting in reflection. I had just read a book by Isabel Wilkinson called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's about the Great Migration. And what touched me about that is that how families from the South had to escape to the North to keep from a family member from being lynched. It wasn't just the oppression of Jim Crow, but actually, just getting out because of life-threatening incidents that might be happening in the family. And I was planning on doing a presentation at a group. We have something called Culture Share, and I was going to speak about the Elaine riots. And so on that same table was Bob's book, On the Lapse of Gods. And something just called at me and said, here you've grown up in poverty, and you've tried throughout your life to fight that whole thing. And I'm trying to link these two books together, and something just says, get in touch with him. See if you can get in touch. I look him up on the computer, and I see the other books that he's written, and he's spoken around the world on another issue, not this particular book. And I'm just overwhelmed. And I just get on the computer and I said, maybe there's an email address somewhere for him. And I find it. And I emailed him. And the title of my email is that I am the granddaughter of Sally Giles, or the Elaine 12. And on the top right-hand side, on my right-hand side, the second person from the right is a person that I have identified as my Uncle Albert. Now there's a little background, we'll go back, about Uncle Albert. When I was a child, born in Arkansas, in Hot Springs, I would hear about an uncle being sentenced to the electric chair. Very young. And I didn't know what the electric chair was, but I knew that it couldn't be something good, an electric chair, you hear that. And I didn't hear any more about it, so that just kind of stayed back in the back of my head. And so when I read the story, I said, maybe that was a reference. That was a reference that my grandmother and great-grandmother were making about my Uncle Albert. And I had also heard that Uncle Jim was sent to a work farm, it was a prison farm actually. And he served the time until Scipio Africanus Jones got all of those people released from those that were sentenced on second-degree murder. He was charged with second-degree murder. So getting back to Bob emailed me within 12 hours of me sending that email, stating that I was the first descendant from the Arkansas 12 to ever get in touch with him, other than someone on the other side. And I knew that he meant Lonnie. I hadn't met Lonnie or whatever. And when I met Bob, the first thing he asked me was, would you like to meet that person? I said, yes, I would like to meet that person that reached out to you and said that he had a descendant that was involved with the Elaine riots. Never discussed in my family, like those are little snippets of what was discussed. I started asking my mother any questions. My mother would come up with little things that her grandmother told her, which is Sally Giles. I have a picture of my great-grandmother, Sally Giles. And Sally would tell her about the women being allowed to go into the jails to dress the wounds of their loved ones. And that was something I was like, they actually allowed the women to take care of the men. This is my great-grandmother, Sally Giles. I don't know when that picture was taken, what year it was taken, but she was a very strong woman, a strong matriarch. She left my great-grandfather, Milligan Alberts, and my grandmother, Annie's father. She had 4 children, and she took Milligan, Albert, and Andy with her to Arkansas to sharecrop. They were originally from Louisiana, Lake Providence, Louisiana, and that's how they started sharecropping. So she would go in and dress the wounds of her 2 sons. And that's really all I know that she did. I think there was another incident that my mother said that her grandmother told her about soldiers coming to her cabin. And that must have been right after the massacre, asking where her sons were. And she just sat on the porch with her arms folded and said, I have no idea where they are, and just left it at that. In Bob's book, he mentioned that the neighbor next door, I guess people witnessed him being killed by either the posse or soldiers, I'm not sure which. The wounds that she took care of, and my mother used to say it was their hind parts, meaning their buttocks, their back, and their legs that were beaten. And apparently, with the electric chair, I didn't know that happened, that apparently that electric chair, the torture in the electric chair, was part of, the wounds were also part of that as well. And the torturing was inflicted to get someone to testify. And I guess Milligan being the youngest of them, they started with him first, being 15 years old. So they started with him first. My grandmother, I couldn't get much information out of her. Like I said, it was just really, really, really re-stimulating. I would have liked to have just sat down and had a real conversation with her, try to get her through the re-stimulation to find out what her point of view of what happened. How did she feel? How scared she was with them shooting in and people dropping to the floor and seeing people get killed in that church. Some people did get killed in that church. As far as my Uncle Albert, after he left, after he was released from prison as part of the Arkansas 12, he wasn't with the Moore versus Dempsey case. So they only used 6 men with the Moore versus Dempsey case. And the other 6, they held all of them in jail. But those 6 men were eventually the 6 that weren't involved with the Supreme Court decision, their sentences were commuted by the government before he left office. Uncle Albert, as far as I know, after he was released, left the state of Arkansas. And the next history that I heard about him was in Springfield, Illinois, that he opened a little grocer, kind of like a restaurant or whatever. And he died, I guess, from being abused. If you're an abused person, you become abusive. It's a cycle. And he died, according to my mother, from his wife. He had married a younger woman, and he would beat her. And I guess she got tired of it. And at some point, she mixed together some lye, and while he was sleeping, poured it into his ear, and he died. That kind of comes into play today with women being abused. It doesn't make it right as far as the family. She was never put in jail or anything for that crime. My Uncle Jim is the last thing. Uncle Jim Milligan. This is Milligan. And he has little pock marks in his face. You can kind of see. I never knew what they were. But he was like my favorite uncle. My mother didn't have any sisters and brothers. So I remember this gentleman. He was a very gentle person. And I remember he worked in Hot Springs and lived in Hot Springs. And he worked in the bathhouses. And he would come home. And as a little girl, maybe 3 or 4, I would sit behind him and just play in his hair and comb his hair. And he would never, ever say, just get away, little girl, or go mind your business or anything. He would just tolerate it. He was just so very sweet. He died mysteriously in Hot Springs, either in 66 or 67. He had become a preacher. And Hot Springs, they were involved in the civil rights movement at that time. And according to my grandmother, and she couldn't tell that story either, because when you ask her what happened to Uncle Jim, she says, they burned down his house. He was burned to a crisp. He was burned beyond recognition, and I could never get that story out. I'm currently trying to go through the death records of Arkansas to see if I can search to see when he died and how he died and was it ever investigated. That's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. There are so many parts to it, but I wanted to ask a question about your grandmother. I mean, certainly it seems that she was silenced, and I don't want to guess by her sheer terror of this situation. Do you think she was able to then process the importance of the Supreme Court decision?
I don't think she was able to. My grandmother remained in poverty for the rest of her life. She was a domestic. She had some, I think, probably an 8th grade education. I don't think she knew how powerful that decision of the Supreme Court was at the time. She didn't know. And she never really could overcome that moment. Whenever you took her there, she could not overcome it. To even give you a semblance of what that story was about. You just got bits and pieces. Yes.
I was very moved by your presentation and your courage and your calm. And feeling the emotion generated from you sitting right in front of you, that is an amazing feat, and thank you. My question is specifically, I followed what happened to Uncle Albert and Uncle Jim. But Uncle Jim, you said in the beginning, became a witness point out the sharecroppers were condemned? I didn't quite understand that.
That's what I read when I first went online. I think it was the Phillips County newspaper, and they said one person came forward to name, because they kept naming people, but they said, as they were arresting them, but they said one person came forward out of those that had been arrested to give testimony, to say that yes, they did go out to kill the sharecroppers. The sharecroppers went out to kill the farmers, that they were planning an insurrection, and that they did kill the sheriff's deputy on the night of the September the 30th. And knowing what happened to him, knowing how he was tortured, I mean, a 15-year-old, really? The electric chair, beatings, whippings.
At that point, what was the family's reaction to him? Just as you said, he was young, he was tortured. You didn't hold it against him?
When I read that account that he was the person giving the testimony, I was a full-grown woman over 40, and I knew that he had to be pretty young because he was either a year older than my grandmother or a year younger than me. So I knew that he was a teenager. So he was just a child, and then with torture. Not realizing when I read that article that he was tortured, I had made the assumption at that time when I read that he was tortured. Gentlemen. It's gentlemen. And then I'll take you.
Thank you so much for that heartrending testimony. And Sheila, what do you want to leave your ancestors that follow you? What do you want them to know and learn about the Elaine Race Massacre? What do you want to communicate with them about this?
Number one, that it was an important event that happened in the United States. One that, like slavery, this country has not reconciled with. There were two important things that I got out of this whole thing in reading Bob's book. And one was that Scipio Africanus Jones was not recognized. It's not recognized in Black history, and he should be. He should be. The first book that I read, the NAACP, kind of, the guy that wrote it was kind of like leaning towards some of the writings from the NAACP because they hired white lawyers, and he was the other lawyer on the case. But really, he was the person that was doing the footwork, the work. He actually worked this case. And the fact that he's not recognized, you can ask any African American, have you ever heard of Scipio Africanus Jones? And there's only one person that I know outside of my family who knows his name, that I asked that name to, and she says yes. This lady is from Arkansas. She's was a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And she says, yes, my father knew Scipio Africanus Jones, and he and my mother named their first child after him. So, and the second thing that I wanted to say about this case, why it's so important, and that's overall, is that the civil rights movement never would have happened the way it happened if it weren't for that case, the Moore versus Dempsey case. This is the young man right here.
How you doing? My name is Rashawn. Thank you Sheila, for sharing your story. So my question is, Bob Whitaker mentioned a bit about some of the justice that came from the Elaine Massacre, and as you just mentioned, is that the case led into some of the groundwork for the civil rights movement, kind of the legislation that was used to pass civil rights law. But Chester also mentioned, and when I think about this concept of justice, I also think about reconciliation and how that plays. Chester mentioned a bit about his meeting you and what that meant for like reconciliation, for him coming to terms with this past. What did it mean for you?
It meant a lot to me. The afternoon that Chester and I met, I was looking out the window as Bob drove up, and I just started crying. I was just overwhelmed that here is a man raised in the South. We'd had a conversation already, but he actually wanted to meet me face to face. And how much it meant. How much it meant to me. I think as an African American whose forefathers were enslaved, people talk about reparations. I think the reparations for this country, for me as an African American, should be that whites, whether they were here when slavery happened, whether they weren't, but it happened in this country, and it happened to our people, should own up to it. Not own up to it and say, well, I did it, but it was something that happened in this country. And recognize that the way things are with my people, even though we have a black president, the way things are with my people, and I can use my family as an example. My mother was an only child, had 8 children, and out of those 8, I had a brother who was in prison for over 20 years. I had 2 sisters, 3 sisters actually, that were drug addicted, and they grew up in Chicago and lived in poverty. And one of the sisters, my younger sister who passed away, it's like it's just a chain. And I always feel, I tell my children, I feel that had they known this history in our family, maybe their outcomes in life may have been different. So I take Bob's book, I buy it for whoever wants to read it in my family, and I send it to them. Just hoping that it will change. It will just break the chain. I'm fortunate that my children broke that chain as far as the poverty and all the bad things that could go along with poverty. They're not involved. One more person.